TESOL Pop, Season 7, Episode 5. Hello and welcome to TESOL Pop, the mini podcast for busy teachers. My name is Laura, and joining me today to talk about making teaching materials more inclusive is Lottie Galpin. Lottie is an inclusive ELT consultant, trainer, editor, and writer. In her work, she helps publishers and freelance publishing people to understand how to create materials that represent the true diversity of the worlds we live in. She specialises in representations of mental health, disability, socioeconomic realities, and in creating accessible materials. Thank you so much for your time, Lottie. A very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So, in today's episode, we're talking about the importance of inclusion in the language classroom and how we can work with existing resources and materials, such as coursebooks, to make our classes more inclusive. As with many TESOL Pop episodes, today's episode is relevant whether you teach English language or other subjects, so why not continue the conversation by sharing today's episode with your teaching community? Lottie, why is it so important that we think about inclusion in our language classes?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question, and it's quite hard to answer just in the time that we've got. So I think, first of all, let's try and understand what we mean by inclusion. It's a tricky term because if we think about including something, that generally means that the people with power are including people with people who are excluded, and that you can see that that's problematic in terms of kind of a power dimension. So inclusion isn't the perfect word, but we'll use it today just because it's quite commonly known and it's easy to work with. So typically, when we think about inclusion, people tend to think about inclusive education in terms of including people who might have, or students who might have additional needs or specific learning differences, like, say, dyslexia or, other forms of neurodiversity. So that's one way of defining inclusion. And that's obviously like super important. We want everyone to be to feel that they belong, to be able to access materials, and to be able to succeed in the classroom. But what I kind of wanted to look at and where I'm coming from is what I would call inclusive content or inclusive representation. And that means materials that represent people who are typically excluded from materials, or people who are marginalized in society. So when we think about ELT materials, typically, not all the time, but typically, they tend to default to a quite a specific norm, and that norm doesn't really represent the world, doesn't really represent our students, doesn't really represent teachers, and that norm tends to be, um, non-disabled, white, heteronormative, neurotypical, quite middle class. So in that way, the representation we give in materials is a pretty limited representation of reality. Um, Now, that is problematic because it can, exclude students. If you can't see yourself in materials, if you can't see someone who looks like you or has a similar identity to you, then logically you're not going to feel that you belong in those materials, perhaps in that subject, perhaps even in education. So the potential for damage caused by not including people is quite large. Um, so when we think about inclusive materials in our classroom, we're thinking about ensuring all students can see themselves. We're thinking about ensuring all students have the language to talk about themselves. So if we're thinking about a common subject like talking about appearance, we need to make sure we're giving students the right language to describe their skin tone, their hair. Um, and the other reason that inclusive materials or inclusive representation is important is that it teaches all our students about the reality of the world. Like all our students, regardless of where they are likely to come into contact with people who might come from, a marginalized or underrepresented background. And it's important that, students know how to interact with people. They are learning those kind of intercultural 21st century skills that really prepare them for the world.
Many of our listeners are probably working with materials that they've been assigned by their school or language centre. I'm thinking about the course books I've had to work with over my career. What tips do you have here for working with existing materials when you want to make your classes and materials more inclusive?
Okay, so if we're thinking about, making them more inclusive in terms of representation, then there are, different things that we can do. And obviously, we can't cover them all here. But I thought we could break them down into sort of three different categories and look at it that way. Um, Right. So the first thing we can do is analyze. And by that, I mean, what we can do is ask students to interact with that textbook and consider how representative it is. Um, so that could be something like having students look at the types of photos and what people are doing in the photos. It could be something like having students look at the types of people that are represented in texts or the types of places that are represented. To give you a practical example, if we thought about gender representation, which is, fairly applicable everywhere, what you could do is start with a video or a text or a social media post about, say, gender representation in films, and use that as an intro to the topic, feed in some, useful vocab. And then you could have students look at a section of the textbook or the whole textbook and look at representation of different genders and how they are represented. So they could simply, tally up the number of different genders. They could tally them up and make notes. For example, there are 23 women and all of them are cooking. If you, it's just to get students thinking about, the content that's there. And then following on from that, you could have students, think about maybe why that's happening. That could be just a bit of a discussion. And then you could follow up with some kind of output. They could write a report, do a video, a presentation, social media post, whatever works for your context. Now, I know that when I was teaching, I tended to adapt from the textbook because the materials weren't quite, relevant for the classes I was teaching, or even perhaps, the country I was teaching in, that culturally it wasn't appropriate. So I think that that's a really good thing for teachers to do to begin to make their existing textbooks more inclusive. So, some things you could do are swapping out some of the photos. So, what you can do, let's say you've got a vocabulary page with, their standard thing, you've got 8 photos, say, of people doing sports and some text exercises underneath. So, what you can do is transfer that text to a Word document and then, find your own 8 photos representing these different vocab items. And that way you can include some more diverse representation. So that might be, a range of ethnicities or including some disabled people amongst those images, but it just gives you an opportunity to vary the kind of photos and images that students are encountering in the lesson. And I think that that's important because photos really do create kind of a landscape and a really strong first impression for students. They're, a very for a generation or for people now that are very visual, they really do have a strong effect on how people interact with those materials.
You've mentioned analysing and adapting or making small changes to a course book to have a big impact. What was the final tip you'd like to share?
So that's supplementing, and really, it's kind of an extension of adapting or changing. But in this scenario, we're either giving an alternative to what's in the textbook or additional material to what's in the textbook. So let's say you have a text about a European inventor. What you could do is provide texts, write, research and write your own texts about inventors from a range of countries or with a range of identities, so women inventors, inventors of a range of genders, disabled inventors, and so on, to ensure that students are getting a more realistic view of the kind of people that invent things, because there does tend to be a default in ELT materials that knowledge and creativity resides in Europe or in the US, and clearly that's not true. So you could do that. In addition, the students would read, say, all 4 texts, or you could not include that text from the textbook and provide those other texts as an alternative. And either of those would be perfectly acceptable, alternatives for approaching that. Um, Another thing I'd say, and one thing I'm really keen on, is relatability and achievability. So sometimes in textbooks there will be activities that are just not relatable for students because, of their own, personal circumstances or where they live, or they might not be achievable because students don't have the life experience to talk about them. So a classic example is talking about foreign holidays. Um, Now, some students won't be able to afford that. Some students, culturally in that country, in some countries, people don't tend to go abroad. They tend to, holiday within the country. So in both contexts, that activity isn't relatable or achievable. So when you have something like that, you can have a look at it and think, well, are my students actually going to be able to do that? And then if not, you can rewrite the activity, but just choosing a context that might be more relatable for the students. So instead of foreign holiday, it could be a day out within their country, just something that is more relatable and more achievable for them to do.
I was going to say this is so important because there's nothing worse than sitting in a class where you just don't connect with the task, and you,
Mm,
like you say, you don't have that life experience. I've certainly been in scenarios myself, both as a teacher and also as a student, where there just
mm,
feels that disconnect. And
mm.
students will go through the motions of doing the task, but they won't really be very motivated to do it because it's just not
Yeah.
representative of their lives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's not representative of their lives, and it might not actually be, of particularly much use to them in real life as well. And if it's not useful to you, you're not, gonna engage with it because, when am I ever going to talk about a foreign holiday if I never go on foreign holidays? You would immediately kind of disconnect, I think. I also wanted to say, just thinking about student generated materials, you can ask students to do all of the above as well. So you can ask students to have a look at the photos, decide whether they think that they're, particularly representative, and they could change the photos, they could research them, and they could do the same with the names and the places. So they could have a look at the exercises and say, okay, I don't know a John, a Jane, or a Peter, so let's replace those names. So again, getting students involved and giving them kind of ownership and empowering them in terms of that textbook.
This has been really helpful, Lottie. Thank you so much for sharing your tips. They're so practical. And like you
Mm,
said, if teachers are feeling a little bit overwhelmed by this, their
mm.
teaching community, their students, it can be very much a community effort and not a sole effort because we know how busy it gets when teaching. Hey,
Oh
so
gosh, yeah, no, absolutely, yeah, yeah.
to find out more about Lottie's work, you can go to her website, lottiegalpin.com, or go to her Facebook or LinkedIn page. And as always, I've included those links in the show notes so you can find them easily. If you have a question you'd like us to answer, or you have a topic that you'd like to pitch for an episode of TESOL Pop, then you can contact us via Instagram, Facebook, or the website tesolpop.com. Finally, you can support the work we do at TESOL Pop by leaving a rating and review wherever you listen to the podcast, or by sharing today's episode with your teaching community, or by even buying us a coffee at ko-fi.com/TESOL Pop.